Hey guys, I'm Eric and welcome back to State of Build. Today we're going to be building an LED pixel blade. But some of you might be asking yourself, didn't he already do a video on this? Yes I did. I created that video for a lower cost blade, this one here. And what I'm doing now is I'm recreating that video for the higher quality version a lot of you guys have been asking for, this one here. The difference is the brightness, the amount of LEDs, and the fact that you can't see each individual LED. Now the cost difference is about double. This one you see here is about twice the price as this one. So let's sit back, relax, and I'll get started. If you haven't seen the first video of me building a pixel blade, I recommend you check that out first and come back. If you haven't though, it's okay. I'm going to go over everything you need to know. The blade we're going to be building is going to be compatible with all Lightsaber soundboards that support pixel blades. It's a common design across all platforms, and I'll cover everything you need to know. I specifically am building this for my custom Profi board lightsaber. I've been using my old thick-walled blade for some time, and I want a much brighter, much higher quality pixel blade that I can use to show off. One thing you might notice since I built this saber in one of my old videos is I upgraded the blade to the Pogopin style from that old locking connector. I'm going to go over why I changed it and what the trade-offs are for using each. First things first, these are the materials you are going to need to build this. Everything you see here is going to be listed down in the description with links. You're going to need a trans white polycarbonate tube. Mine is 1 inch in diameter, that's to mate up with my saber, but they also come in 7/8 variants. Mine is a thin-walled blade versus a thick-walled in my last video. The reason I chose that is because I'm not going to be dueling with this blade and I want it to be as bright and as diffused as it possibly can. The length is up to you, depending how long you want it. In my case, I'm going to be going for about 39 inches, which is about as long as my LEDs will go. So I'm going for the longest blade possible with a single 1 meter strand of LEDs. But if you want a shorter blade, you can cut it and we can work with that. You're also going to want a foam tube that fits inside this diameter polycarbonate. I bought both of these from the custom saber shop. It's probably the easiest and most convenient place to find this, and they have these two in a bundle that fit perfectly together, so you don't have to worry about things not fitting correctly or making your own foam tubes. In the past I made my own diffuser, but this one is a lot easier and also more uniform down the length of the blade, so you won't have any lighting issues. You're also going to want a thin-walled tip that's hollowed out so you can put another pixel on the end. Again, from the custom saber shop, they sell everything in kind of like a package, so that way you don't have to go out and search for it yourself. It's a lot easier that way. You're also going to want a pixel PCB cover cap. This is what holds these PCBs in place. And then obviously just the pixel PCB itself. I'll put the link down to where I bought this from. You're also going to need 2 5-volt pixel LED strands, 144 LEDs per meter. There are 12-volt versions, so make sure that you buy the 5-volt. It does make a difference. This brand, BFT Lighting, is well known among the saber community as one of the best quality brands in terms of brightness and durability, but at the end of the day, any brand will do. There are also 2 different types of pixel LEDs, this WS2812B, and then there's also another type that starts with an S. It doesn't matter which one you use as long as your saber soundboard is compatible with that. Most of them are compatible with both, so you shouldn't run into any issues there. You're also going to need at least 24 gauge wire for the power connections. This here I have 12 gauge wire, but the minimum, absolute minimum, is 24 gauge wire. You're also going to want thin wire for data. 28 gauge is what I'm going to use, but you can use anything down to 30. The size doesn't matter. There's no power that actually runs through this wire. And lastly, some super glue to hold it together. A lot of people use epoxy, but I like to use super glue in case I need to take it apart to fix something. Epoxy is a lot harder to get undone. And then also some sandpaper. Sometimes these 1-inch tubes don't fit perfectly. They're a little oversized and they won't fit perfectly in your saber, so you might need to sand it down a bit. Pretty much all of these materials from the custom saber shop except for the LEDs. These materials are pretty difficult to find specifically in the way that you see them here. You can buy close ones like I did in my first saber, but it's hard to get exactly what you're looking for. So I'm not affiliated with this company at all. They just make it very easy to find what you need. So the LEDs can be found in many places like Amazon, AliExpress, or straight from BFT. Their company sells them directly. So those aren't hard to find either. And then the other materials you can just get at your local big box store. So real quick, let's talk about why you might want to use the PCB style connector on your blade versus the locking connector. So if you want to duel with your saber, you want to be looking at the locking connector, and you want to use thick-walled blades instead of these thin-walled that I'm using here. Why? The Pogopin connection method is pretty weak, and because of vibrations and stress on that connection from dueling, it can fail pretty easily, or your saber, the lights can come in and out frequently depending when it's getting hit. So the locking connector is a lot stronger. It reduces vibrations because you're not held inside the hilt. It has these wires to kind of reduce the vibrations on here, plus it's locked. You can't pull it apart if you wanted to in the first place. So the benefit of using the Pixel PCB though is convenience. It's so much easier to remove and switch blades. If you store your saber on a stand without the blade, you don't have to mess around with the connector every time you want to use it. You can just loosen your set screw and pop the blade in and out. So I don't duel with sabers very much, so the decision was pretty easy for me, and the cost for the conversion is only about $20 just to buy this stuff. One thing I do want to note though is that these connectors, even though they come with your LEDs, in a lot of cases they are not rated for the current that is going to come through your blades. So I bought these from BFT. This is a good brand, and I would trust these connectors. A lot of people still don't trust these connectors even if they come from BFT. If you look at the wire closely, you can tell that it says it's 20 gauge, and the connection here, it's hard to tell exactly what type of connector they use and if it's rated or supported. If you just want to be on the safe side and don't want to risk it, you can buy pre-made JST connectors that are 24 gauge, that are locking, that you know are going to be safe. Alright, now let's get on to building this. So once you get your blades out, one of the first things you want to look for is this. This is where they've stitched together two separate strings to make a full string. Every single strand that I've ever gotten was stitched like this at some point in the manufacturing process. And if you notice, there's a gap compared to the rest of the LEDs. So if you install your blade like this, you're gonna have an LED gap. It's gonna look like there's a pixel missing, or there's a dead pixel somewhere. You don't have to do this if you can live with that, but it's highly recommended that you fix this first. So I've got my soldering iron here, I've got my solder. All we're gonna do is cut this and shorten up this connection. That's all you need to do. You're just trying to go from this to this. Try to close up that gap by just cutting off some extra of that strip there. So now that both of the splices are fixed, next what we want to do is we want to look at these arrows. Look at the orientation. Each pixel there's also a little I and a little O. Input and output. The orientation matters. We want to line these bad boys up so that they're both facing the same way. So we have the ins on both one end and the outs on both on one end. So this is the part where you have to decide what you're going to do. Cut these off if you're doing a Pixel PCB. If you buy your own connectors so that you know that they're a little higher quality, cut these off as well. We're going to have to solder those on. But if you're keeping these, then you can keep them on the data inside. But either way, everyone's going to have to cut them off on the data outside. So next, we're just gonna peel the sticky back off of these and stick them together. Just make sure you check the orientation again. You want the arrows going the same way. So you do not want to solder the two strands together. It might be tempting, but if you look closely where it says 5 volt and ground, 5 volt and ground are flipped. If you solder these two strands together, you're going to short the entire strip together. You're not going to want to do that. Besides, you want each strand to have its own separate connector. If you're using 24 gauge, if you're using 22 gauge, you can combine them, but you don't want to short it in that way. So if you're just using a connector like this, the wrong type, you're just going to go ahead and solder them on like normal. But if you're like me and you're using PCB pixel connector, you'll see that there are rings here, and then on the back side there are 6 pads. So we're going to be soldering wires from the strand to the back of these 6 pads, and then this is what actually connects to the saber. If you look closely, you can kind of see where the metal is touching. The outermost ring is for power, the innermost ring is for the pixel data, and then the ring in between those two is for ground. So if you look closely on the back, you can see that there are 2 pads here and here that are connected to the outer ring. There are 2 pads here and here connected to the middle ring, and then 2 connected to the inner ring. This design was on purpose. If you see, there's kind of like 6 solder points here, 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 here. This kind of matches up to that, and it's actually in the correct orientation. So that's how we're going to be soldering it. There's an easy way to do it where you can set up a little jig to hold it in place like so that way all your connectors are the perfect distance apart, and it's pretty easy to solder. Soldering it by hand while the connector's laying flat is actually pretty difficult. So if you follow my instructions, you'll have a pretty easy time doing this. So my jig is just the connector that we're going to use to hold it inserted into something or held up against something else to kind of keep it in place. We're going to put this in backwards like so that way we can solder to it like so. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is solder directly to these, and then we're going to solder it to here next. And we can kind of push the wires and put them in a position that we want them to go, so that way it's a lot easier for us to solder here. Now the length of the wires that you want is pretty short. Honestly, it's as short as you can get it is better, but for a good rule of thumb, about the width of the pixel strip is a good length to go by. So I'm going to cut out 4 wires of this 22 gauge that I have. 24 gauge is also fine, and 2 wires of this 28. Any wire gauge is fine for the data. So the 2 outside are going to be for the larger gauge, and the 2 inside are going to be, or the 4 outside, sorry, and the 2 inside are going to be for the shorter or the smaller gauge. Alright, so next we're going to cut these down to the right length. These are a little bit long for my taste. If we were to trim and solder it on like this, that's pretty long. I'm going to shoot for about this distance, give or take. That's where I'm going to trim and cut to. Alright, so now that we got the lengths down, we can line this up and very delicately push on all of these wires to line them in the correct spot. So that all we have to do is just get it in the right spot and solder together. We don't really need to worry about any wires being misaligned. So there we go, we've got that soldered, both sides. 5V are going to the outer ring, ground is going to the second ring, and digital in is going to the center ring. So now we can just pop out the PCB and actually install it in the correct orientation. Got virtually no empty space that's not going to be lit up. This is, this is going to be into the saber up until here, but we were able to minimize the amount of wire needed to solder this together while making it fairly easy. So the next thing to do is cut the saber to the correct length. Now, I'm going for the longest blade that I can get with these LEDs. I don't want to splice in any more LEDs, so I'm gonna shoot for that. If you're shooting for something else, all you have to do is cut the saber at whatever length you want and then trim the LEDs, because you can cut each one of these LEDs individually. You trim it to whatever it needs to fit. Now, we bought that parabolic tip that has space in it for exactly 1 pixel. So if you want your blade to stay this length, you would cut your pixels 1 further than that, so that way it fits in the tip like so. So if this is our length, the back of the blade is exactly where the back of the strips is exactly where the back of the blades are. And we want 1 pixel to stick out, and then we take into account that there's this little lip on here that needs to be attached. Then we want to cut our saber right about there. So I'm just gonna put a little mark with this screwdriver in there so I can have it. And that's where I want to cut my blade to get the appropriate length. So now you can cut this stuff with pretty much anything. It's plastic, you could use a hand saw, a miter saw, a table saw if you really wanted to, a Dremel, countless. There are specific cutters made for cutting PVC and stuff like this. What you don't want to use is something that squeezes the material. Nothing scissor-like. That's going to deform it and it could cause it to crack. You want the types of cutters that you would either spin it around if you're doing it by hand, or sawing motion that's actually cutting it in half. And then when you're done with that cut, you want to come back with your sandpaper, 120 grit, whatever you want to use, and sand off those edges. Alright, so I've made my cut. Now we're just going to put it together. I already have the bottom piece on from earlier, so we're going to slide this tube on next, this tube on after that. If you can't get the LEDs in here very easily, it helps if you just squeeze it a little bit and get it going in straight. You want it to go in straight and pretty easily. If the LEDs start to twist, you might get some funky lighting situations. One thing to help the LEDs go in a little bit easier is to trim the top of this. So since this LED goes into the tip of our blade, it's okay if we just cut all of this excess stuff off. So if I cut a little notch into it like so, I've had better luck getting it in. Just make sure you don't accidentally cut off one of the capacitors, but all the rest of this PCB is fine to take off like that. there we have it. The tube is fully inserted. So we're gonna have to trim off a little bit of this foam tubing, but I'm gonna do that after I put the blade on. So if you have any extra foam sticking out the top, it's okay to cut some of that excess off, but as you can see, there's exactly 1 pixel sticking out the end of this blade to fit in there. This is what you're going for. In this case, my foam kind of compressed a little bit as I installed it, so that's fine. So now this tip will fit perfectly over top, and I'll get a nice illuminated tip when everything's lit up. So I usually recommend that you test it out before you glue everything together, just in case something was wrong. So that's what I'm gonna do. But before I can actually install this into my hilt, I'm gonna need to sand down this portion here that installs. My hilt is exactly 1 inch on the inside, and this blade just happens to be a little bit larger than 1 inch, and there's also a lip here that needs to be removed. So I'm gonna go in with my 80 grit sandpaper, very lightly remove the material until it just barely doesn't fit anymore. Then I'm gonna come in with a higher grit, and then a higher grit after that, probably up to 600 grit, so that I get a nice smooth finish on here. Now, when you sand this down, it's gonna go from this shiny appearance to a more matte finish. So I'm also gonna take the rest of the blade with the 600 grit so that it matches down here as well. So I sanded down this plastic piece, the insert, just enough so that it will fit in my hilt so I can test it before I glue it up and so it's lighting up. It doesn't look like there's any gaps whatsoever. Yeah, so we're looking good. So I'm gonna glue this up so that way it's a lot easier to sand it all down. So everything's glued up now, but I still can't insert this into my hilt. The bottom of this blade section is still too wide. So I'm gonna hit it with more sandpaper until it fits. And if you're doing this too, just go really slow. You don't wanna go too small because then your blade's gonna be loose and that's gonna be just as bad as it being too big. So just take your time and work from high grits to low grits once you start getting close. So I'm back from my sanding marathon, and I don't know if you can tell, but the saber's a little bit more matte now, and I was able to get the bottom diameter down to the right size. So now if I insert it and turn it on, you have yourself a high quality blade. So real quick, I'll put up the difference between the first one and the second one that I've done. The video never really does these things justice because it washes out the color and you can't really tell the actual brightness, but this is 2 to 3 times better at least. So guys, that's it for this video. If you like this video, leave a like. If this video helped you in any way, please consider subscribing. It really helps out the channel. And as always, thanks for watching.